Thumb culture made no provision for abstention. Professor Probrius was out of a job. It was as the instructions had promised. He could not miss the Palace of the Golden Gates. It was taller by at least a dozen stories than all the other ziggurats. It bore the name Origen in large letters above the entrance, and then again at sky level, and it had golden gates. Buses were already congregating in the concourse outside the palace, spilling lucre tourists who marked it in their I Spy book of monoliths before being driven off to the next one. A protest was taking place in what happened to be a designated protest pen. From the spirit in which the demonstration was being policed, Professor Probrius deduced it was a regular occurrence and posed no immediate threat to the building's security. As the symbolic focus of the Republic's satisfaction in itself, the palace had been the scene 3 years previously of the first of the artisanal bread riots, the most violent public disturbance in the Republic's history. For years, the only activity in Urbs Ludus had been the construction of towers. Nothing else was made. Even the bread was flown in from somewhere else, and invariably arrived stale. Sick of white-sliced loaves, dry muffins, and inelastic pizza bases, the populace demonstrated in such numbers that the authorities had to import a labor force of skilled dough-makers from countries outside the wall. But there was an unexpected consequence. Soon, Urbs Ludus woke to the realization that the Republic was flooded not with artisanal bread, but with artisans. One section of the population turned against the other. The wealthy had their brioche, but the poor had to queue in hospitals behind those who made them. Crime increased. Petty larcenies at first, but then offences against the person, especially against women whom, it appeared, many artisans had never previously encountered, at least not in the immodest dress considered appropriate in the Republic for the wives and daughters of property developers. Viewed within the palace as further proof of man's insatiable ingratitude, this latest disgruntlement was permitted to express itself quietly where it could be monitored. But there could be no doubt that the populace, albeit a different social stratum thereof, was on the growl again. Professor Probrius had come to the palace to be interviewed for the position of tutor to the Grand Duke of Origen's second son, but now, due to unforeseen circumstances, the heir presumptive, Fracassus. He introduced himself at reception, where they looked so affronted to see him not wearing a coat that he thought it wiser to put it on before taking it off. Security was strict but smiling. He was required to show 3 forms of identification and leave his smartphone in the pigeonhole marked Information Transmission Devices. 2 security officers patted him down, one for one leg, one for the other. A third, wearing a face mask, asked him to say "ah" into a balloon. There was no knowing what means the latest enemies of the game economy, whether artisanophiles or artisanophobes, would deploy next, and germ warfare, passed from mouth to mouth, could not be ruled out. Professor Probrius exhaled. "Ah!" The balloon filled, but didn't change color. No one seemed to have expected it would. Then he was invited to take a seat. Above the reception desk was a painting in the style of Titian, showing the Grand Duke playing golf with the Pope. Professor Probrius shook his head as though it were a kaleidoscope and he wanted to change the shapes in it. There was so much light reflected from the crystal chandeliers that it was possible he was not seeing what was really there. But no, there, leaning on his silver putter, was the Grand Duke of Origen, and opposite him, and laughing, with the Cardinal standing in as his caddy, was the Pope. The only remaining question was whether the painting commemorated a real event or a fantasy one. Eventually, he was shown up in a lift to the 117th floor and ushered into the presence of the Grand Duke and Duchess. Though they'd been sitting at a table playing the board game Cash Flow, which the Grand Duchess, wanting a quiet life,